We have the honor of having amidst us Dr. Sonam Kinga, the Chairperson of the National Council, Parliament of Bhutan, and Ambassador Alok Sen, who is former Indian Ambassador to Myanmar and a very distinguished member of the Indian Foreign Service. Before we begin, I would like to give a brief introduction of Dr. Kinga. He was earlier the Deputy Chairperson of the National Council, Parliament of Bhutan, and has served as he has headed several committees of the National Council earlier. He also has a distinguished career in journalism and he is a prolific writer and has authored several books. And before I hand over the stage to Ambassador Sen, I would request you all to please turn your phones on silent or switch them on.
His Excellency Dr. Sonam Kinga. I would like to explain the structure of the meeting today. Dr. Kinga would be speaking for about 20-25 minutes, but we both feel thereafter, if there would be questions, he would bring out the substance even better, because then he can address the questions and more information can be given. By way of an introduction, I would like to say democracy is a very delicate plant. It doesn't find receptive soil everywhere. We don't have to look very far. If you look at the Indian subcontinent itself, in 1947, two countries began from the same starting block. They had the same political, economic, social backgrounds. One flourished with democracy, the other didn't. It's very difficult to say why democracy takes roots in one country and not in the other. I have also seen during my professional career how introducing democracy is such a difficult task, where people are not ready, where the governments are not ready. My last posting was Myanmar, and I keep thinking of their success or failure with democratization. In that sense, what we are going to hear today would be extremely interesting. And Bhutan is a good neighbor, a friend of India. I'm sure we'll be all benefiting from what Dr. Kinga has to tell us. And as I said, thereafter, I would be expecting some questions to come from you. Thank you, Dr. Kinga.
Good evening, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor and a pleasure for me to be here this evening in Kolkata, the capital city of a state that actually borders Bhutan. And for Bhutan and the Bhutanese people, when we talk about India in the conventional, traditional sense, our realm of thinking usually used to extend to Assam and West Bengal and then Arunachal Pradesh. So the smell of hilcha, fish curry, makes us feel very homely. My appetite has been growing since I landed at the airport. But I'd like to thank all of you for being here this evening and allowing me to share with you my perspectives and thoughts on the story of Bhutan's recent democratization process, which began only 5 years ago. What I intend to do this evening is highlight and share how and why Bhutan's democratic transition has been a unique process. Look at how different social groups in the last 5 years have come to interpret and understand democracy, and then look at some key challenges that confront us in the process of democratic consolidation. Before I begin, I would like to think that maybe besides knowing that Bhutan is a small country and a very good friend of India, and indeed right in the neighborhood of Bengal, perhaps most of you may not have some key information or understanding of this country. So allow me to begin by introducing Bhutan itself, very briefly though. So it's a very small country in terms of area, and usually by area I've been taught to understand that is length times breadth. So it's 38,000 square kilometers, which means it is about 80 times smaller than India, maybe 250 times smaller than China, two very large countries that encircle Bhutan. But the country is full of mountains. And therefore, if you think of area as a length time breadth times hypotenuse, Bhutan could be a potentially large country, but indeed we do not have the intent of flattening Bhutan and making it a large country. We are happy right up in the mountains. Our population is just about 700,000, 7 lakhs, less than 1 million. A very small country, but very large in terms of diversity, because we have about 24 ethno-linguistic groups for that small population. And most of the people, about 68%, depend on subsistence farming for livelihood. Although generation and export of hydroelectricity to India constitutes the major economic activity, followed by tourism. Most of the people are Buddhist, but we also have a sizable Hindu following. Our GDP, as of last year, I think these days no introduction of a country is complete without talking about its GDP. It's about rupees 113 billion. Long before there was a sense of what we may call in today's lingo a national government in the Himalayas, the first Buddhist government was established in 1626 in Bhutan, by a person whom we refer to as Shabdrung, the founder of a national political community. Before that, what existed in Bhutan were about 25, 26 very small village-based political communities. So it was in 1626 the Shabdrung came from Tibet to avoid political persecution up there and formed a national community in Bhutan. And he and his reincarnations, rather than his son or their biological descendants, came to reign over Bhutan for the next 250 years. So the dynasty established then was not one of heredity, but one based on theory of what we call multiple reincarnations. However, after the death of the founder, power initially was exercised by people within the monastic establishment, but gradually fell into the hands of lay officials and provincial governors. And it was they who would put the reincarnations of Shabdrung and those of his sons to serve as the sovereign of the country, and then pit one reincarnation against the other. Sometimes there were 2 or 3 reincarnations appearing at the same time. And what this resulted was in growing factionalism of power built around different reincarnations. So for almost 250 years, although the national polity founded did not fragment into the kind of village-based political communities that existed earlier, but there was a sense of loss of what we call a larger communityhood, a nationhood. So it was a period characterized by political instability, civil war, factionalism, contest for power. With the establishment of monarchy in 1907, a kind of reunification and a restoration of political stability was possible. Now I would like to make an important point here, that the Bhutanese monarchy is just over 100 years old, founded in the 20th century. and an institution that is not based on the concept of divine rights as monarchy usually tends to be associated with, but actually founded on a written contract signed among the founding monarch, provincial governors, and community representatives. And when I use the word representatives, I put that in an inverted comma. Monarchy in Bhutan came to symbolize what the preceding, not theocracy, but an ecclesiocracy, as I would like to call it, symbolized. Monarchy became the agency of socio-economic development and modernization in Bhutan. His Majesty Jigme Gesed Namgyal Wangchu, the present king, is the fifth in line. For most of Bhutan's history, we followed a very conscious policy of isolation, not intending to get dragged in regional global developments, such as the Great Game, such as the Cold War. We initiated our modern socio-economic development program only in 1960-61 with the generous assistance of the government and people of India. But our socio-economic development was focused less on industrialization and more on social sectors, delivering health, education, transport, communication. So Bhutan's development took place with minimal industrialization. As a result, what happened was Bhutan's culture, tradition, lifestyle, and indeed the natural environment continued largely intact into the 21st century, which provided a framework that may be psychological or otherwise for people visiting Bhutan to think of it as a Shangrila. Even today, people who visit Bhutan, they think they continue to discover it as a Shangrila. But of course, how the Shangrila has been experiencing democracy is the theme of my presentation today. Shangrila, or Bhutan's destiny with democracy, began on 9th December 2006, when the fourth king, the father of the present king, decided to abdicate voluntarily after reigning for 34 years at a very young age of only 51 years, although the constitution, which was drafted under his command, requires a king to abdicate at age 65. So he could have very well continued reigning as a constitutional monarch for the next 14 years, but he chose to abdicate. Now, in a body of academic works, literature called transitology, that dedicates itself to studying regime change, democratic transition, the absence of, or rather the rarity of such abdication do not find scholarly explanations. So for example, one scholar asks, perhaps the most difficult prerequisite for democratization is the authoritarian regime's willingness to initiate the transition to democracy. Another asks, the most difficult question is what would make the dominant groups of the regime decide to begin the process of transition, or perhaps more realistically, what would make them tolerate any articulation of pressure for transition. And the obvious concern here that the scholars raise is that no regime would willingly initiate democratic transition. This Shangrila, Bhutan, democratizing, sort of teased and contested conventional models of regime change and transition built upon experiences of many other countries. And what I'm going to do now is examine some such models and discuss how Bhutan's experience cannot be situated in them. Based on the modernization theories of 1950s, liberal democracy has been projected to be the modern mode of organizing socio-political life. Modernists, and what sometimes we call the structuralists, argued that societies underwent progressive stages of development, but societies were not seen as democracy candidate until they fulfilled many preconditions, such as a rise in income or GDP. One scholar, that a country that attempts a transition to democracy when its people have a per capita income of $3,000 to $6,000 would be successful. So democracy was post-development, not pre-development. And their primary argument is that economic development brings along with it social and political institutions of modern Western society and creates an alternative center of power that would challenge the state power. These arguments do not hold for Bhutan, as perhaps they do not hold for many other countries in Eastern Europe and Latin America when poorer countries began to democratize. As I mentioned, Bhutan's socio-economic development began in 1960, but the sort of political liberalization has preceded it a decade earlier when the third king, in fact, established the National Assembly in 1951. When we embarked upon the transition period in 2008, Bhutan did not fulfill many of these preconditions that have been identified as prerequisite. So, for example, our GDP was only US dollar 1,321, far less than the benchmark the modelists set. Now, another model of regime change has been what's known as the elite pact or bargain. Its advocates argue that there must be first a national unity, a state that must exist before democratic transition can take place. But in that state, there is a period of a long, protracted struggle where the elites, which is not homogeneous, agree to negotiate, bargain for power, enter into a transaction, and that has been identified as one of the linchpins of triggering democratic transition. In Bhutan's case, the elite was a very small group and very homogeneous. Most of the traditional elite belonged to eminent Buddhist lineages, families scattered across different communities, and those who made it to the rank of the elite were part of the state, did not exist in opposition to the state. So they were like ministers, senior public servants in the bureaucracy, in the armed forces. So there was no other elite group outside of the state with enough resources, financial or otherwise, to be able to challenge state power. So let alone the existence of a long and a protracted struggle, Bhutan did not have a situation where elites bargained or negotiated for power and triggered the democratic transition. Now, another model that attempts to situate democratic transition beyond what the modernists and the elite pact theorists argue is what has been called the imperatives. Some factors propelling transition, such as domestic internal factors and external factors. I would like to talk about this a bit. One of the most important internal factors is said to be the regime's loss of legitimacy as a result of its failure in delivering economic development and political performance. In Bhutan's case, the monarchy, rather than suffer any decline in legitimacy, it has been, as I said earlier, the agency of socio-economic modernization, and actually a very successful one at delivering that. So the last 3.5 decades, during which the former king reigned, saw high increases in literacy rates, enhanced access to basic social services, modernization of transport, communication, development of trade, industry, mass media, and indeed significant political reforms. Another internal factor is said to be the agency of the middle class. Advocates of this theory argue that even if a regime is successful in delivering economic development and political performance, democratization is still inevitable. So irrespective of the fact that a regime is successful or not, as long as it's authoritarian, economic democratization is an inevitable political process forward. So it has been argued. Now, what it means is that economic development creates a sizable middle class which becomes the agency of transition. Bhutan's socio-economic development, again I would like to repeat, took place with minimal industrialization, which means there has not been a major displacement of labor force from the agriculture sector to the industrial and manufacturing sector. In 2008, for example, when we embarked on the democratization process, the contribution from the manufacturing sector was only about 3% to the national revenue, and industrial workers, people working in the manufacturing sector, the middle class, so to say, including civil servants, constituted only about 3 to 4% of the Bhutanese population. Most industries in the manufacturing sector were established by the state, and the state's share in these industries even today is quite significant. Hence, the middle class and the working class largely depended on the public sector for their well-being, which means there was no basis for the middle class to become an agency advocating regime change. Another internal factor for democratization is said to be class conflict and peasants' movement. As modernization proceeds, it's argued that the size of the peasants decline and that they come to depend on the landed elite. Industrialization and urbanization creates a working class or bourgeoisie, and class conflicts leading to violent revolutions. As I said in the beginning, in Bhutan's case, peasants constitute 68% of the people, and in 2008 nearly 30% of them lived below the poverty line. However, most peasants in Bhutan own some agricultural lands. Those who do not have enough lands can always apply to the state, to the king, and seek land titles. Alternative arrangements are always made by peasants, such as sharecropping, in order to make subsistence livelihood available. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the peasants have access to some source of subsistence livelihood. On the one hand, their tax obligation is very negligible. But on the other hand, the state's budget for rural development, for rural communities, infrastructure development, social service is quite significant. A negligible tax obligation, but a huge budget for peasants who largely inhabit rural communities. Therefore, a basis for a peasants' movement asking for a regime change also did not exist in Bhutan. Now, let me look at two external factors that are conventionally identified to be the source of triggering democratic transition. One is said to be peaceful pressure applied on an authoritarian regime by way of diplomacy, economic assistance, and sometimes sanctions. Aid is made conditional to political reforms, and where it doesn't work, sanctions are imposed. The Bhutanese government was never under any international pressure to democratize its political system. Political reforms, as I will speak later, have been an ongoing process. As a least developed country, Bhutan's development partners, of which India is the most important one, have never used the leverage of economic assistance to force regime change within Bhutan. Another factor identified is democracy assistance, not economic assistance alone. This includes assistance to strengthen democratic institutions, monitoring of elections, reforming governance, etc. And the entry point for democratic assistance is largely thought to be the timing of elections. In Bhutan's case, His Majesty the Fourth King commanded that all expenses for elections in 2008 must be met from domestic resources. And this was an important command to ensure that the democratization process, particularly the elections, remain free of external pressure. But I must put on record that with the assistance of the government of India, we brought in hundreds of electronic voting machines, and they're proving very beneficial and successful in conducting our elections, particularly for a small country like Bhutan. Now, for all these reasons that I briefly talked about, it is problematic to locate Bhutan's experience of democratic transition in prevailing models or experiences of regime change. The question that then arises is, what is it that triggered Bhutan's transition? Our view in Bhutan is that it was a critical decision of leadership. And when I visit a body of literature trying to study regime change, locating the agency to leadership, I come across only two such scholars, one of whom calls it transformative leadership and the other innovative leadership. Democratization studies and theories, it seems, have not paid sufficient attention to the agency of leadership in democratic transition and looked for other explanations such as the modernist theories, such as imperatives, such as the elite bargain, elite pact. Now, the question that arises is, why did the fourth king of Bhutan decide to introduce parliamentary democracy in the first place? I must mention that parliamentary democracy did not come to Bhutan suddenly out of the blue in 2008. When the fourth king was enthroned as the king in 1972, there was already a national assembly established by his father way back in 1953. But he committed himself to deepening the political process by establishing grassroots development organizations which have become today local governments. Decentralization became the defining political signature of his reign for over 3.5 decades. In 1998, for example, he stepped aside from being the head of government, chose to remain the head of state, and had that National Assembly elect a cabinet for a fixed 5-year term. The previous cabinet did not have a term, but that was dissolved by him. In 2001, he commanded the drafting of a constitution. So all these reforms were initiated when there was no popular demand. And the question is, why democratize when there was no popular demand? So in order to answer this, why democratize when there was no demand, we fall back upon the king's own pronouncements and statements, which were in fact an articulation of a vision of democracy for Bhutan. So what were the constituents, the components of those vision? One of the fourth king's very repeated pronouncements in public was that the future of the country lies in the hands of the people. And that was a very bold statement for a king to say, that the future lies not in the king himself, but in the hands of the people. He said that the people must now assume responsibility for themselves, and also said that it's important to trust the people that they have the integrity as well as the capacity for self-governance. Second, he said, the king said, that the inherent weakness of a monarchy is its dependence on one person. So let me quote him. He said, the flaw in the monarchy is that you reach very high and important position not due to merit but due to birth. The intentions of kings may be good, but what if they change or when they change? Therefore, the need for an institution and a political system that rests on the wisdom of all the people rather than one person. Third, he said that Bhutan needs a dynamic political system to adapt to a changing society. That political system must suit the needs of the Bhutanese people and need not necessarily be one that is important, but one that is homegrown based on Bhutan's tradition, culture, history. Finally, he said that democracy was a viable political institution for Bhutan. If it hasn't worked elsewhere, it does not mean that it was not the best of political arrangement, but because of abuses by those in power. In April and May 2007, Bhutan and the Bhutanese people participated in 2 rounds of nationwide practice elections, what we call mock elections, in order to prepare for voting in the actual elections which were held 8 months later in December 2007, and then for another house in March 2008. And His Majesty, the present King, himself led people into the practice exercise of voting. When we went to elections in 2008, the common understanding of democracy was that it was a gift of the 4th King. Discourse on democracy was structured on the understanding that it was a gift of the 4th King. How different groups in society interpreted and internalized this understanding was not easily discernible by them. However, 5 years down the line, when we again went back to the polls a few months ago, certain ideas of democracy have become more crystallized. Now I'll try to share these ideas and perspectives based on the experiences of the last 5 years. Again, let me begin with the peasants. Their perspective of democracy remains developmental. As I said earlier, the Bhutanese state, embodied by the monarchy, was a development state, and that the monarchy has been the agency of socio-economic development. People's perception of the monarchical state was as a modernizer, as a developer. The democratic state continues to be perceived and experienced thus by the peasant community. And rural development projects in the last 5 years have actually enhanced this image and raised greater expectations. Bhutan's small but a growing urban middle class do not dismiss or undermine the importance of a development perspective, but has begun to put far more emphasis on constitutionalism and rule of law. For Bhutan and Bhutanese democracy, this has been a very important development, that the middle class starts to look at democracy from the perspective of constitutionalism and rule of law. So this small group has been voicing strong concerns of key national issues such as corruption, unemployment, economy, and to some extent even foreign policy now. So although the middle class is small, its views and opinions are beginning to have important impact on public discourse when we discuss bills and legislations, and also on the electorate's voting behavior. The media, both mainstream and social, have become an important means of articulating alternative and sometimes dissenting views, particularly of the small middle class. And a good indicator of democracy establishing itself in Bhutan now is the boldness with which media is beginning to publish very critical editorials, investigative stories, that has prompted agencies like the Anti-Corruption Commission to not only investigate but prosecute public officials. The monastic community constitutes a very important group in Bhutan. In the earlier National Assembly and a conciliar body called the Royal Advisory Council, monastic community had representations. However, call it modern secularism also, the idea that religion and politics should be separate and that the religious personalities and institutions must remain above politics have found way in our constitution. And the Election Commission has actually interpreted that provision by not extending voting rights to members of the monastic community. So in 2008, there were members of monastic community who felt that they were being excluded from the democratic process. On the other hand, there were also other members of monastic community who thought this was a good arrangement, since their vocation required them to be non-partisan and that they would not be politicized by associating or being identified with particular candidates or political parties. In the eyes of the monastic community, a democratic government must necessarily continue supporting the Buddha Dharma. As Bhutan's spiritual heritage, the state continues to provide adequate resources for the upkeep of the monastic body. But now, voices are being articulated by members of non-state monastic community for similar entitlements and support. The image of the Bhutanese state as a patron of Buddha Dharma is also being carried forward in democratic Bhutan. Within the parliament, where people like me sit, democracy has played out as a process of negotiating social relations and power dynamics. Not just between members of one house, but between members of the two houses, between the government and the legislature. Disputes over bills and disagreements over key issues have seen very heated but healthy debates, and major differences have centered on issues such as the primacy of legislature over executive, different interpretations of the provisions of the constitution. So democracy came to be perceived as a space for renegotiating social relations and power dynamics. What are the important challenges that Bhutan faces in the process of consolidating our democracy? In his very first address to the first parliament, His Majesty the King said, "As King, henceforth it is my sacred duty to ensure the success of our new democracy so that it will serve to fulfill the aspirations of our people. As King, his responsibility ensure the success of democracy." So one of the most important challenges for us will be to think of democracy not as an alternative to a monarchy that was already successful. Democracy did not develop in opposition to the monarchy. The monarchy gave birth to the democracy. Now democracy, we all agree, is about empowering people in local governments, the institutional arrangements at the community village level to realize this principle. One of very big challenge for the Bhutanese state and the government is not to think of, not to perceive local governments as an extension of the central government or another bureaucratic agency. Local governments are autonomous by our constitution, and that autonomy, both in terms of human resource, financial resources, needs to be continually promoted. The danger otherwise is that of the growth of a patron-client relationship where the central government becomes the patron and the local government the client, and decision-making and resource allocation is based on this relationship rather than on more democratic grounds. A rather unhealthy trend in the last 5 years has been repeated instances of the previous government to label groups or institutions with different and alternative views as disloyal and unpatriotic. Democratic politics and discourse, we believe, should not be framed along binary opposites of good and evil, patriotic and unpatriotic, loyal and disloyal. Rather, different players and institutions need to be seen as playing their legitimate oversight and check and balance functions. So, one of the challenges now is to expand the political space to accommodate alternative dissenting views. Electoral corruption will be a major challenge hereafter in the process of consolidating our democracy. Bhutan is a very small country, as I mentioned earlier, with a very even smaller voting population. So for individuals or for institutions with significant financial resources, it will be very easy to buy actors, players in the political process. So voter education and stringent laws concerning electoral corruption are priority issues for us, and we have begun to talk about it now. The most important challenge for consolidating democracy is citizens' education and understanding about democratic process, institutions. More so, citizens need to understand what their fundamental rights and duties are in a democratic polity. Unless the people are aware of their rights and duties and the opportunities of participation, avenues of informing and influencing decision-making process, the process of consolidating democracy will remain a big challenge. What happens is, voter education conducted by the Election Commission has largely been very procedural, very technical, fixated to election cycles. There is a now need to move beyond election cycles, beyond procedural and technical aspects, and also a need for an institution dedicated to citizens' education on democracy. But perhaps the greatest challenge is how contests for control of government by candidates and parties could possibly sideline key national issues of a small country like Bhutan, but focus on concerns of partisan groups, vested interests, and short-term gains of power. And for a small country like Bhutan, that will be very unsettling and destabilizing. In conclusion, I would like to say that Bhutan is democratizing at a pace and in a manner it has chosen. However, elected leaders like myself in this important phase of democratic consolidation has this great responsibility of establishing the right institutions, setting the right precedents in terms of the intent of our policies and legislations, and conducting our public service in a manner that does not become the object of cynicism, distrust, and indifference by the people who chose to place their trust in us. In the process of democratic consolidation, Bhutan will continue to draw inspiration and strength from monarchy, which is the symbol of unity of this demographically small but ethnically large country. In the vicissitudes of democracy characterized by elections, changes in government, contestations for resources and entitlements, monarchy will continue to symbolize and represent certainty and continuity, but more so represent ideas of social justice, equity, and national community. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank Dr. Kinga for the fascinating presentation. Every country's democratic journey is unique, so is Bhutan's. But Bhutan has been also very fortunate in having an enlightened monarch that voluntarily made it possible of Bhutan's democratization. Many observers of Bhutan thought that when the political process began there, the people were apolitical. People were apolitical. They were discovering something new even to them. But democratization itself is a political process. So that's going to change. I had a question in my mind when I came here. As Bhutan changes, the political nature of Bhutan's administration changes, what would be the impact on foreign policy or on development policy? But you have already answered me. I mean, I was listening very carefully. The middle class, the media, the role you mentioned, I think that answered that question. And you have been extremely candid when you talked about the challenges facing democratization. This has to be an ongoing process. Even in India, there is no end to the democratization process. We learn every day. So we would be wishing Bhutan's young democracy all the best in future. Now I would be inviting questions, comments from the audience. Dr. Kinga has agreed to answer them. Yes.
National Council. So for matter of convenience, we say National Assembly as a lower house and the National Council as an upper house. But the fourth king made it very clear that this nomenclature called upper and lower house should not be used in Bhutan case because they have different nuances. So for example, members of the National Council, the upper house, are directly elected and have equal legislative power. I sit in the National Council as its chairperson, but members of the National Council cannot belong to any political party. So for example, I was re-elected, so both in 2008 and 2013, I chose to contest for National Council, and we cannot belong to a political party. The first thing that you are required to declare when you file in your nomination is that you do not belong to any political party, because the institution of the National Council is apolitical. So I do not belong to the government or the opposition party. I represent a different facet of Bhutanese society. When I talked about the 24 ethno-linguistic groups, even that figure itself is a consequence of a democratic dialogue. People, anthropologists, political scientists who have been writing on Bhutan till about 2006-07 have largely limited the number to about 18 to 19 ethnic groups. 2 years ago, when I asked the previous Home Minister about a more inclusive policy in terms of promoting Bhutan's diverse culture and tradition, he responded that time to say that there are 24 ethno-linguistic groups. And in fact, this jump from 19 to 24, so about 5 to 6 is a subcategory, sub-ethnic, so to say, of the Bhansam community, of ethnic Nepali community. So usually the tendency was to think of the ethnic Nepali community as one uniform social group. But then there has been this boldness and thinking within the establishment that in fact there are more groupings and categories. So this number 2 is a consequence of sort of democratic dialogue. When I had to ask him a question and when he responded, so I used that figure now. The movement, so to say, in the early 90s, that has been, as you say, driven by people of Nepali ethnic community is a moot point. It depends on how you first problematize and define the issue and how you, in fact, even, for example, say, use the word like minority, because we tend to take for granted these politically very powerful words as a given. What is a minority? Who were the minority at that point of time? Were the people who started a movement really Bhutanese citizens, as some claim, or as the Bhutanese argue, illegal immigrants from eastern Nepal largely, who have made inroads into Bhutan, settled there for a long time, but escaped detection. So the issue is, firstly about defining the issue itself, and then problematizing certain words, concepts and ideas used in describing the discourse of that particular movement. So some would say ethnic cleansing, some would say removal of ethnic communities. But from Bhutanese point of view, it was about dealing with a widespread illegal migration that has taken place over a protracted period of time that actually threatened people who were legitimate citizens of Nepalese ethnic community. There was contestation for limited resources. However, for the ethnic Nepali community within Bhutan, and again, the word Nepali is a very generic term, and we must be sensitive to other subgroupings and categories within it, as I mentioned earlier. Not just in the present democratization process, but through the process of nation building that really took place after 1960s, the attempt for an inclusive building of a national community, as indicated by their representation in the former parliament, in the former conciliar body, in the civil service, in the armed forces, and in fact, rather, as the Bhutanese state argues, a more generous share of development budget towards the south where the Nepalese ethnic community dwell, has been a cause of concern for the other Bhutanese community. So that inclusive process is not something that started in 2008, but has been an ongoing process of Bhutan's nation building since the 1960s. And it is something that we will continue to promote, irrespective of which ethnic community or which ethno-linguistic group we belong to. That is, and that must necessarily be the nerve of our democratic consolidation process hereafter. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Process. One of the very first initiative of the fourth king in order to democratize Bhutan was to create an independent media. So, one newspaper called Pencil and a radio media. But by 1993, the king decided to corporatize them. In 2006, one of the first decisions that he made was to open up space for private media to come in. And that's when someone like me started a newspaper called Bhutan Observer, based largely on the idea of reporting from rural communities and giving peasants and their struggle with wild boar and elephants more focused than what was happening in the capital city or in the towns. So, two newspapers were established, private newspapers established in 2006. Then radio stations came to be established, and today there are there are 12 newspapers in the country. For a very small population in a small readership, 12 newspapers. The one that I opened had to close shop. I'll tell you the reasons later. It went online now, not because of any I'll come to that issue later. Now social media too has become, like Facebook, Twitter, is catching the imagination of the younger population and actually becoming an instrument of and a platform for democratic discourse and dialogue. One issue that the media face in Bhutan is, as I said, Bhutan's economic development took place with minimal industrialization. So the so-called private sector in Bhutan is actually very small. I even question whether it is the private sector. And 2 weeks ago at a college foundation day ceremony, I said the private sector in Bhutan is the agriculture sector where peasants own small plots of land to try to do some business livelihood here and there. We need to rethink Bhutan's private sector as the agriculture sector. The problem with the media, therefore, is that to survive and operate as an independent organization, the dependence on revenue on private and corporate sources is very minimal. So therefore, all media organizations depend on state's advertisement budget to survive. So you just have a fixed pie, which also gets shrunk now, and then there is a growing competition. So when there was only the two state-owned media earlier, it was okay. There was actually a monopoly of fixing your publication tariff also. But when the private newspaper came in, they began to eat into that fixed revenue. However, because the pie, the advertisement budget does not grow, but the claimants to it increases, private newspapers have been facing serious survival issues. That's why the newspaper that I started, which I don't own, and which I left after 1.5 years, because I can't be associated with the media once I joined the political process, has closed shop purely because it was no longer able to sustain. There have been instances. Okay, now the most important thing, the role of the media is, both in 2008, then in the next 5 years, and in the last elections, it has played a very critical role talking about candidates, talking about their issues, asking whether the campaign promises they are making are realistic or whether this was a high-five, something thrown out just to garner votes. Media, especially with the coming in of the private newspapers, have started, as I say, publishing bold, critical, investigative stories, questioning public authority, questioning ministers, and one of the very first instances I remember is something nothing new to India or to other democracies. But the very first time in 2006-07, when we started to put cartoon caricature of our leaders, that itself became a statement of a change in the air. And the kind of reaction from the people saying, how could you do that? So you say, how can we do that? Why can't we do that? But most, I mean, I can go on talking about it because I worked in the media, but let me end with this. Firstly, social media, especially Facebook, and some particular actors who acted anonymously had an important agency in the election of the government in 2008 and in the defeat of that government in 2013 elections. 2. A private newspaper revealed the involvement of the previous speaker and the previous home minister in possible corruption cases of taking over peasants' land, and then the Anti-Corruption Commission, based on media's report, investigated, prosecuted, found them guilty, and they could not contest in this year's election. If they contested, they would have won. They were very popular in constituency, but being popular alone in constituency did not guarantee an easy ticket. If you have any criminal charges taken cognizance by the court, you cannot qualify as a candidate. So they could not qualify as a candidate. Thank you, sir. In Bhutan, I talk of a few things. Firstly, it is about the extent of state resources given to agriculture sector, which is actually the rural sector, and how these resources are channelized to build rural infrastructure like health clinics, schools, roads, but also channeling them in enhancing productivity of agricultural and livestock products, yields. The idea of rural development as something geared towards environment, biodiversity, is an issue that is more a concern of a growing urban class, something that is more urban-centric. That's how the discourse has been shaped, although this should not necessarily be separate, but should be interrelated. Now, I think we take our genetic natural resource endowment too much for granted. So, for example, the tradition of healthcare has largely been that of what we call the indigenous medicine treatment. In fact, even to this day, the importance and the relevance of traditional medicine has not come down. In fact, it's finding even a more important place. But our sources of medicines are not something that we cultivate. That's why we say we take it for granted. So every year, once in a while at a particular season, you will see technicians and researchers and scientists from the indigenous medicine hospital in very remote parts of the country, picking herbs, plucking flowers, and transporting them down to Thimphu on the back of yaks and horses.
How conserving them?
Sorry?
Sooner or later these will be lost.
So, exactly. So now there is already a dialogue being initiated to say how long can we just go on plucking, and the demand is increasing. So exploitation of these natural resources will naturally increase. So how do we sort of conserve, but also perhaps grow and cultivate in similar terrains, in climatic conditions? The other question was about Bhutan's location between China and India, having two different political systems, how we balance them. In the first place, Bhutan's intent, either through its domestic or foreign policies, has never been, nor will it ever be, to balance China and India. I think we respect the wisdom of the Indian leaders as well as the Chinese to exercise their own judgment in doing that in geostrategic dynamics. Our interest is first that this is very special, and we do not see it as a matter of diplomacy or being politically correct. We see it because we have felt it, we have experienced it, and it has been embedded in our conscience. That this special relationship cultivated with India, nurtured by our leaders, must necessarily be strengthened and taken to greater heights. And the very reason that I am here today, for example, not as a politician, not as really as a chairperson of the National Council, but finding an opportunity to talk to people like yourself, is to take today our relationship forward and diversify it. For us, and this is something we always say, when we look up north, we have the mountains, the natural barriers. When we look south, where Bhutan ends with the mountains, the Indian plains start. We are a very landlocked country, and Kolkata is a very important entry point for many goods and services coming into Bhutan. And at your back, there are many officials from the consular office here for this very purpose. I just use Kolkata as a case in a point. But the importance and the significance of India, not just as a development partner, but because we know from a security perspective, from a development perspective, but also from our spiritual, historical and spiritual legacies and interactions, that the future of Bhutan and that of India is linked. It is interdependent. However, a powerful neighbor like China is something that we cannot pretend not to exist. It is a reality. It's a neighbor. We have different political systems. But I think democracy in Bhutan is here to stay. As I quoted His Majesty the King, he said, asking hereafter, my task is to ensure that democracy succeeds. To ensure that democracy succeeds, that people like me and others participate, is also to ensure that we respect the will of the fourth king. That the destiny of Bhutan as a democratic polity is something that we do not even think of questioning, but something that we want to build upon. Thank you, sir.
We have a time constraint. Actually, we have already overshot the time allotted to us. But seeing the interest, we'll take two more questions. There.
Bhutan did not have an army before. It had a royal guard. Now an army is being raised. What is this system being put in place to see that the army does not take power?
Thank you. Bhutan was formed in a state of war. And in 1626, when the Buddhist government was first proclaimed, the people who participated in nation building at that point of time were the local militias, and they have a long history. But our standing army really got established in early 1950s. So in 1950s, you see many developments: establishment of a legislature, establishment, beginnings of a standing army. The Bhutanese army was initially trained in Shillong by IMTRAT, Indian Military Training Team, and we have a small contingent of IMTRAT in Bhutan who continues to impart that training. So the military in Bhutan, supported by the Indian military, has been a presence not just 5 years ago, but since the 1950s. His Majesty the King is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The size of the army is very small. I think it's about 8,000 at the most, consisting of the Royal Bhutan Police, the army, and the Royal Bodyguards. Our constitution does not see an enlargement of the military force. Rather, we are thinking of an alternative arrangement, like a militia that can be raised in times of need. So we doubt, and I would not even extend my imagination to wonder whether that military develops as something separate to society and contest for power, take control of it. Within the kind of arrangement that we have had, I do not see that possibly happening, because firstly, the king is the commander-in-chief. He is the guardian of the constitution and democracy. The role that military plays in the region, perhaps, for very historical reasons, for its size, and also for the role it has played in Bhutanese development. It's more well for
we are doing lots of social works with the military these days now. So I do not see that happening.
Well, everyone sees that.
And the state that it has arrived today has not happened naturally or by accidents. That every step has been cultivated, nurtured, and commitments at the highest political level are made to ensure that this deepens. So therefore, although Bhutan is a very small country, India a large, powerful country, I think, and in Bhutan we have this confidence that India will never ever take for granted the kind of relationship that have been painstakingly built and with sacrifices too. So having said that, Indo-Bhutan relationship will diversify. In a democratic polity, questions will be asked. In fact, there are, I think, instances during the election time, campaign period, when issues were raised. And it is completely okay, people talk about it. In future, you will increasingly see people in the opposition asking critical questions, demanding explanations, suggesting possible recourse. But at the end of the day, whoever comes to power will know that this relationship is something that cannot be taken for granted, needs to be promoted both for the benefit of India and Bhutan. It is not a one-way traffic. The benefit is two ways. And I think perhaps even beyond Indo-Bhutan. The allusion to some of you may be aware, some of you may not be aware, what has happened was we had 2 rounds of elections for the lower house. We have a primary round where lots of political parties contest. It's a multi-party elections. Then the 2 parties that win the maximum number of votes go to the general round. So our National Assembly will always have only 2 parties, an opposition and a ruling, not a multi-party. But multi-party elections is the one conducted before the final round in order to screen 2 parties. The primary round, multi-party elections was over, and then the general round has not happened. Meanwhile, what has happened was India provides, amongst its other generous economic assistance package to Bhutan, subsidy on kerosene and LPG gas. Just before the elections, the subsidy stopped. Many started to discuss both within Bhutan and in India as a deliberate attempt by the Indian government to withdraw, to use your word, and therefore try to influence Bhutan's politics. For 2 reasons, we contest this. First, again as I said, we believe that the majority of Indian leadership and the sort of relationship cultivated will never allow Indian leadership to consider even such. We have that much faith, and I do not think Indian leaders will stoop that low. No way. First. Second, the more technical reason is, like in India, I think, maybe not like in India, our fiscal year begins on July 1st, it ends on June 30. Election was on July 30. Not only has the fiscal year ended, the 10th 5-year plan also ended on June 30. So July 1st, the 11th 5-year plan begins. All the subsidy and aid package are built into the plan, so they follow the plan cycle. So the explanation provided by the Indian ambassador in Thimphu that it was technical because the plan period ended and there was no government, there was an interim government can't take policy decisions, and there was no continuity in terms of dialogue for the new plan and therefore the subsidy package, and therefore it sort of ended at that point of time, was not withdrawn. And that convinced us. People talked about it, but I thought that this was indeed a technical and a procedural issue. Second and third, before the third, we know that soon after the election, correspondences, talks, this subsidy was restored. And we are very thankful for that. Third issue, to argue that this action influenced the electoral outcome cannot stand. Now we can have 2 very convincing reasons as to why this argument, if it exists, can be contested. First, in the primary round,
the previous government has won more than 50% of the vote in 16 constituencies. Of course, it claims it has won in a lot of other constituencies, but there were 4 parties. But you would have technically won if you had won more than 50%. It won only in 16 constituencies. If this withdrawal in inverted commas, or this temporary suspension of subsidy have had an impact, the ruling government should have lost in those constituencies. But we know they have won 15 seats. So 1 seat, there's a swing, So from that analysis, it does not stand. The other reason is when we look at the vote swings taking place, 4 new parties were formed, and that itself was a statement of dissent with the ruling government. In the primary round, they chose to contest among themselves. Mind you, let me repeat, that the very formation of 4 different new political parties in 2013 was a statement of difference and dissent with the existing government. So, in the primary round, they all contested, but when the new parties lost, it was logical for them not to support the previous government, whom they in fact, they were formed in opposition to it, but they chose to support the other party. So therefore, when you look at the vote count, when you look at vote swings, the argument that suspension of LPG and kerosene subsidy impacted does not hold ground. But people talked about it. And in a democratic polity, we can't disallow people from talking. We must in fact encourage more and more debates. Thank you, ma'am.
I would just really point to that, since I was a part of the Indian Foreign Office, we do not take Bhutan for granted, most definitely not. But the relationship between 2 countries is a dynamic process. So sometimes you have irritants even in a very close relationship. But I don't think that characterizes India-Bhutan relationship. I'm very sorry, there are so many questions, but I'm under instruction now to close the session. Thank you very much. We saw a lot of attention. Samarth, I think you would be...
Thank you so much, Dr. Kinga and Ambassador Sen, for sparing time for this interaction. Your engaging presentation, Dr. Kinga, was very helpful in making everyone understand the challenges and opportunities facing Bhutan in marking the transition to democracy. I would also like to thank all of you on behalf of Aspen Institute India and the Thimphu Seminars for attending today's session. Thank you very much.